All right, as usual, popping up the PowerPoint. It's good to see everyone. Oh, come on now, computer. It'll take too long. There we go. Excellent. So welcome back. And for part two, so I was just reading before you guys came, this book. It's Augustus and the Creation of the Roman Empire. You can't see, the light's doing something weird. There we go, Augustus, we get it over, there it is, sorry. Augustus, and this is a book that we get from one of our publishers, and it really is a collection of articles and primary sources about an event, about whatever. We have several of these. And this one's instructive because obviously Augustus, who I usually really stress his real name, Octavian, as opposed to his title. That would be like calling President Obama, President Trump, or President Bush just president. President and blank, blank, blank. Well, we have lots of presidents. Of course, Octavian gets away with being called Augustus because he was the only one who took the title, really, of Augustus. Caesar's name, of course, becomes synonymous also with leadership, so his name kind of gets carried over in a reflection. But it's interesting, and I was looking at Octavian's writings and some things that he was saying because of how he plays into the decline of the Republic. So last week, as you hopefully remember, you got to see the video, what we saw was in Rome, they had established a type of government of the people. Now, I want to pause there for a second just to re-emphasize why am I even doing this session. So this series, I felt, particularly coming out of our election, and I felt this way really since the 2000 election, when so many of our citizens were perplexed and frustrated and slightly annoyed that then Governor Bush was declared the winner in our system, even though he had not received the most popular votes. And you heard over and over and over again, but aren't we a democracy? Aren't we a democracy? And we've talked about this many times here, but I thought it would be useful as we finish the 2020 election to just kind of take a moment and go a little deeper into trying to understand not only the distinguishing marks from antiquity about these two systems, but what we'll do next week is look at what happened in the 1700s to our current day, to where for many people, the two words are synonyms. Now, I will still argue that they are in no way synonyms, but I'll try to make my case next week. But you see this all the time in all editorials, all of our presidents. We talked about it briefly in the end of our last session. We looked at the kind of social and cultural change that occurred in the late 19th into the early 20th century. When you look at the speeches of our presidents, for instance, say through the 1800s, they always, when they would refer to the country, would often refer to the republic, to the republic, to the republic. There was always a sense of doing things for the republic. And when you get to 1920, after President Wilson, you see a very clear shift that becomes even more pronounced under President Roosevelt, FDR, of talking about our democracy. So something happened in the linguistics and in the understanding, I'll say in the West, although clearly this is spread globally, the idea of that these two things mean the same thing. And in fact, if you, for instance, go on the Britannica website and you look at their long article about democracy, they take deep pains to blend these two words together. And I would take deep opposition to their view. So we'll try to explain it. But to me, I thought we can't really explain what we saw at the end of that last session without pausing and backing up. Because maybe I'm wrong. Maybe in the original structure in Rome and in Athens, they really did mean the same thing. And it just was different words because one was Latin and one was Greek. And that's possible. So I wanted us to look at it. So we saw last time that starting in 509, the Romans sought to bring in the people to the government. And we talked about how all across antiquity, the structure is that what I call the power pyramid, but the idea of an elite power at the top of whatever the social structure was, whether it was an empire like in Egypt or in Persia, or whether it was a tribe in some spot of say Africa or China or North America, or whether it was a city state like in the Mesopotamian Valley. there was always someone, and usually a singular one, and always or almost always a male at the top. And then there was everybody else. And so for me, this says that A, that's the rule, and B, maybe it's what we as a species prefer, which of course then that raises questions about our own pursuit of a government of the people, or any sort of government that would broaden the deciding or the decision making away from the singular point. So that's antiquity. And then we noted that in Rome and in Athens, they go different roads. So we looked at what they did in Rome after they overthrew the monarchy, so that they overthrew the person at the top. They go through a period of about 50 years establishing a reaction that ultimately becomes what we call the Republic. And it's from the Latin, the res publica, the public affair, or the things pertaining to the public. And what the Romans wanted to do at that time was establish a method by which representatives could speak for the people. That is how it starts. As you can see at the bottom of the slide, by 287, the people fought back. So that's a kind of a distinguishing factor we'll see at the end of our session in both Rome and in Athens, that it's not like they wrote a document and then it was perfect and everybody was happy. Much like in our own country, as time went by, factors emerged that led to some changes. And maybe when we talk about, and we will at the end, like why in particular for Rome does the Republic fall, and like what opened the door for Octavian, maybe ultimately the warning to any country, but certainly our country, the United States, is that there has to maintain a flexibility and a willingness to pursue reform, to kind of recognize that culture and society has changed. Well, anyway, the Romans by 287 had established what we would call like a bicameral, or certainly a divided power structure, where you had the Senate on the one hand and the Assembly on the other. And they, in essence, had two distinguished executive powers: the consuls, of which there were two, and the tribune, of which there was one. And the tribune had a veto power, which is Latin for I forbid. So they had veto power over decisions. So you can see that there was a give and take and a play. And if you read the writings and the histories of the time, so not modern histories of the time, but of the time, you can see all the same sort of political intrigues and power struggles that we see in our own country, not only today, but over our full 240 something years. And in which, you know, at different times, different people are appealing for power. And there was always this awareness that you couldn't do anything without the people. So you see this kind of back and forth as they kind of go through the process. So that's kind of where we left off with Rome. And again, this is a very complicated slide. I don't, you know, my peer Joshua Robinson showed it to us when we looked at the Roman Empire, when he taught for us earlier last 2019. So you can see how complicated their constitution was, or their structure. I wouldn't even really call it a constitution. That's a little misleading. But they did have the law written down in a thing called the Law of the 12 Tables. But the main thing I want you to see is that it developed over time in a reaction against the rule. And they developed in a system that was within a city. Right, so within a city where there would have been small enough numbers to basically invite everybody if they'd wanted to, they didn't invite everybody. So even though they considered it, you know, a system by which everything was governed by this SPQR, this idea, you'd see it on the Roman legions would march with a big pole, and there'd be a person walking, much like we have battle flags saying the Civil War, and across the top would be SPQR. And it was basically saying this is the Roman Senate and the people of Rome. So whatever they're about to do, in that case military, it was all the people. But the people never voted on things. There was no direct influence. They could vote on people to be members of the assembly. They could watch the assembly, just like we could go to Congress or go to Tallahassee or go to your local commission meeting for your city or your county. You can watch, but you couldn't vote. You had somebody voting for you. And so this is where we kind of left off. So now this then is where we stop. And I want to just pause here. And we're going to go and say, well, so what happened in Greece, or really we would say in Athens. So here's a map of antiquity. As you can see, this map says 1400, but it gives us kind of the major players. And of course, you hopefully know the Greek peninsula. And the Greek peninsula is really a series of peninsulas in which there were city-states that existed. Now, I think it's important here for me to point out to you guys, when you look at antiquity, I think you can see several patterns that have held true for all of the 6,500 years of human recorded history. And I think that there's clues in all those truths or those patterns that are beneficial if we recognize them. And some of these aren't like definitive, like this is good and that is bad. It's just like saying this is a thing, right? So for one, like I said to you, the norm of the species, as weird as we may think it is to want there to be somebody in control. I think at some level, Freud would say that's probably a daddy thing. We want a daddy to be in charge. But it's interesting when you hear politicians and sort of the 20th century, oh, democracy is what everybody wishes for. Well, the billions of people who've been alive since antiquity would beg to differ. Well, here's another example. When you look in antiquity, you see that society almost always is in one of two sizes. It's either the very large or the very small. And so when you start off in the beginning of what we call the Bronze Age, you notice there's the very large Egyptian empire, but then there's the very small city-states within the Mesopotamian Valley. So here on this map, you can see where Ur and Uruk, and they call this Babylonia, but that's really a misleading term. There will be an empire of Babylon, but that's 1,000 years later. Well, so I mentioned that just to point out to you, up here in Greece, there's no Greece as we know it. It's instead just a land of city-states. It's a peninsula of individual city-states. Now, for us in our day, we hear city-state and we think of like Tampa and Orlando and Miami, and they're just the large cities. And then there's smaller cities like Lakeland or Winter Park or Daytona. And we don't think that there's really this difference. That's incorrect. These city-states, it's better if you think of them as small nations. So in their minds, if you were an Athenian, you were not a Corinthian. If you were a Corinthian, you were not a Spartan. On and on and on. So in their minds, there's no Greece of any specific nature. Instead, there's people living in a geographical locale in which they govern life together. Now, initially, a lot of that is tribal, meaning there's familial relationship. Everybody living is probably in some way related. That's going even back before written history. But you still end up in this scenario in which the places are geographically confined, and then there's a little bit of a no man's land over who has influence over surrounding areas in which there would not be any specific city. Greece has three major, well, now there's four or maybe even five if you go into the AD period, but and in the BC period era, there's three major periods of time. Antiquity, there's a dark ages for the Greeks, and then there's the what's called the archaic Greek, or it's really the high period of what we consider Greek thought and Greek development. The antiquity period is the Trojan War, the time that Homer writes about, the Mycenaeans, and there certainly were city-states there as well. Well, it's in this latter period that we begin to see the Greeks really developing the city and developing this idea of an independent structure. And then the questions begin to emerge as these cities grow in size and they break apart from being familial. You would still have, so the Greeks had three ancient tribes. So if you think of these tribal peoples as being related to each other, so there was three that were close enough together that ultimately merge into generally a thing we call Athens, right? But as they grew, they no longer were in a place that they could defend themselves with, only elite warriors, kind of the Achilles thing. When you think of the Trojan War, it really was a war of the heroes, Menelaus and obviously Achilles, the Trojan heroes, Hector, and there's not really a thought of everybody fighting or fighting as a citizen. But in this period post their dark ages, you do begin to see that coming to where there's kind of a citizen armies who gain in importance in defending, their city. And so when you see this, this begins to raise questions of how are we governed. Now, the Greek city-states were like all the other places in antiquity, power pyramid. So a person at the top. When you read this in modern sources, they'll talk about a king or a monarchy. I think those are modern terms that are applied backwards. You don't really have the word, obviously you don't have the English word king at all. You have words that in the different languages that imply, again, the person who's in charge. And for us, it's easier to just call that a king. But you have to be careful not to bring in kind of a Middle Ages view of monarchy when you hear that word king. So there wasn't somebody at the top. But what's also always true, and again, a lesson from antiquity, is there's always rich people. And these rich people have more power than everybody else. And I think quite naturally, these rich people like to maintain their power. They want to keep their power. So there's always this sort of sense in which, as you look at societies growing, and this is going to be true in Persia and Assyria, it's going to be true in Israel, it's going to be true in Egypt, it's going to be true in China and India, there's a struggle, right? When it's a family and there's a tribe, and you can imagine almost at the top of that tribe is the grandfather, the patriarch, right, of the group, people probably just expect that and get along with it. When there's multiple generations, you might imagine, as we said before last time, the strong man, the strongest warrior or the richest person in charge. But once you begin to break out to where you have a group that lives together, but there's no relationship, there's blood maybe, but we're talking 5-6 generations back now. You can't just get away with, well, that's grandpa, he's in charge. You have to have another system. And so with these warriors, this hoplite class, they begin to gain wealth, and they obviously have importance because of their military position, right? So even though I'm not anybody, I'm just one of the foot soldiers, you guys need me. And so we should have a voice in what's happening. And so this leads to kind of an explosion in the various Greek city-states. And if you studied Corinth, if you studied Sparta, if you studied Thebes, Thebes is not as important right now, but will become more important. If you look at the smaller city-states, you see this as they're kind of thinking through a lot of ideas. And this is a moment in time where you see the development of the Olympic Games, you see the full flowering of the Greek gods and kind of the Greek religion, you see the expansion of kind of Greek colonies as the numbers grow in the city-states. They don't really seek to expand their lands right immediately around them. It's almost as if they kind of accept the idea that there's a boundary for, say, Corinth, and we're not going to just take over land, to our east and our west. Instead, they send people out to form new colonies. And so, but eventually, through 500, all these coastlines are colonized by Greek peoples. Now, in every spot or almost every spot, they're having to relate to the locals. And so just like in our own national story, where you have people coming to colonize and there were native people there, and you have the relationship that we talk about, particularly around Thanksgiving, happening. Same thing happened here. There were people who lived there. And so we know there were Italian tribes on the Italian peninsula, since we just mentioned Rome, but the lower part of the boot and most of Sicily becomes Greek and Greek speaking. Interesting though, when you look at this, at no point do the Greek city-states ever talk about some kind of like larger unity. There's no expression of a pursuit of the very large. Remember the two types of government. If you study world history, you can see this kind of moving pendulum between the very small for a geographical entity, a civic entity, and the very large. Brexit is an example of a pursuit to the very small. what Catalan is trying to do in the, I guess, the northeastern corner of Spain on the Iberian Peninsula to break away and get independence, and they're not finding any leverage, not unless they're willing to fight for it. They want to pursue to become the very small. Meanwhile, you've got other places, the EU as a group, perhaps Russia and their conquest of the Crimea in the past, say, 10 years, of that kind of engagement still of the very large. And the debate that I think that has happened through world history is which is better, big or small, and we won't go down that road tonight. So for the Greeks then, and you see the development of the religion through Delphi up here at the top. I don't know if you ever had a chance to go to Greece, but Delphi is beautiful. You know, it's the center of the religion. Olympia, where of course the Olympics are from, and Athens. It forms this kind of perfect triangle that they believe is a signal of kind of the influence of the gods. So they did have commonalities in these places, but again, they're not thinking in terms of we should unify. And here's Delphi, if you ever got a chance to go, it's beautiful. So in Athens, because now we're going to focus on what Athens did. Just like before, power pyramid, leader at the top, little smaller, rich upper class, and then of course the larger everybody else at the bottom of the pyramid, right? In the 700s, there begins to be a movement to, I guess, reflect the tensions of the hoplites. And government begins to shift to a group they call the Areopagus. So kind of like a council. It was a very small group, and it was completely controlled by the upper class. As you can see, in 650, they established their own executive position called the Archon. But unlike the Romans, who had 2 consuls, they ended up with like 9. So it's not really an executive position. When you have 9 people, when they were writing our Constitution, some discussion was whether or not our president should be a group of 3 or 5 people. And then I decided, yeah, that just won't work within human nature. And I personally agree. So one of the big problems for the Greeks, like we saw with the Romans as well, is that you didn't have law written down. So here's another lesson from antiquity. One of the things that you can see studying, certainly in Western civilization history, but I think true in all areas, is the moments when the law is written and known versus the moments when the law is not written. There's always law. There's always a set of rules that governs. But there's times when you see in societies that they don't have the law written, and typically those are always bad for human rights. Then there's times when the law is written, which can have still human rights abuses, but typically it's better, because if I can read the law, then I know what is required of me, but I know it's required of you as well. In this process, it was easy for the upper class to abuse this unwritten law. And as you got closer to the 600s, there began to be a problem of debt slavery. And this is the idea that people were economically in trouble and would basically take out a loan, and as their kind of equity on the loan was their personal bodies. And then when the loan failed, they went into slavery. So this begins to be a problem within the hoplites, who felt like a lot of this was unfairly structured. So this leads us to the beginning of the Athenian road to democracy. And it's really important that you talk about the Athenian road, not the Greek road. A lot of people talk about Greek democracy, and that's bad. Don't do that. Because there was no Greek democracy. The Spartans would just strike you down and kill you for even thinking that they should have democracy, which they thought was the dumbest idea they'd ever heard of. The Spartan government is much more like the Romans' initial start. So 2 monarchs, 2 kings that rotated in and out, but 2 people. So eventually we get to our first key leader. And with the Athenians, it becomes a little easier to understand because you get 4 leaders. In the Roman story, there's Brutus at the beginning, but there's not really a specific leader that you can point to kind of say, oh, and hang your hat on, oh, knowing that name helps me understand what happened. But in the Athenian journey, 4 names. The first one, Draco. You probably automatically go, oh, wait, is this where we get the word draconian from? It is. So knowing the word draconian, you know Draco's backstory. An incorrect way to think of these 4 steps or these 4 people is that it goes bad, good, bad, good. I think a more accurate thinking about it is that each one contributes to the journey. Perhaps 1 and 3, Draco and the who we're going to meet in a minute, have a more negative side to them compared to 2 and 4, but they're not bad. Draco did something very good. He wrote the law. Draco was tasked by the Areopagus to write a constitution. So he was their James Madison. So he did. He wrote a constitution, and it was extraordinarily harsh. And it was so harsh that we get the word draconian from it. I mean, it had the death penalty for a lot of stuff, including many things you and I would think would be quite trivial. I mean, you've heard of eye for an eye, and we read some of our ancient law codes, and somebody steals something, so their hand gets chopped off. And there are some societies today that have similarly harsh codes, and we're in the West, we're offended by that because yes, that was wrong to steal, and there should be some punishment, but cutting off the guy's hand, but Draco's like, nope, forget his hand. We're taking that guy out. He's just bad. He's bad for the mix. So we're gonna get rid of that guy. But it did decrease violence. That's one of the interesting things when you really study punishment, effective punishment that is punitive sometimes has a very good effect. Machiavelli would certainly argue that that is a good method to go. Not surprisingly, though, a very harsh set of laws is not something that people can handle or will accept for a prolonged period of time. So this leads us to the number 2 person, and that is Solon, who I think actually deserves more credit than he gets. If you Googled Greek democracy, you're probably going to get Pericles, which always astounds me because Pericles has nothing to do with it. And then you should get the 4th person who we'll meet in a moment. But I think number 3 and 4 merely built off of Solon. So Solon, because of the tensions amongst the hoplites with the upper crust, is elected as the single archon. So this is unique, right? So the Areopagus is like, okay, fine, forget this 9 thing. We're going to go to 1 person. So that's interesting. And Solon sets up and structures and begins working to reform Draco's constitution. And what he wanted to do, even though he was an aristocrat, he had made his fortune as a merchant. So he'd worked with the middle class, we might say, and with the larger lower classes. And so Solon wanted to structure the Athenian government to allow more participation. Now, broadly, what we could say is what Solon structures is where the Romans ended up. I think that's a fair way of looking at it, because he does not really structure a democracy per se, but he does open up government. He basically creates a 4-tiered system of citizens. So, and it was connected to, we would say, your money, which then that makes us feel uncomfortable. He connected it to literally how much grain you personally produced. And he had a method by which they could measure even a landed worker, their production value to the city is X. So that places you in this different category. So one thing that does is it gives mobility, right? You could actually move up in the groupings. That was good. And then he opened the system in a way that allowed not only the common workers to have a voice through a vote, but also to open the position so that in the Areopagus, the second tier, so non-rich, non-aristocracy previously, could enter in and be chosen as one of the archons. This was kind of a big deal. He goes and reforms a lot of things in the city. He abolishes debt slavery. Solon's the one who begins to put Greece in broad terms through Athens on the road to be the land we think of olive oil, right? So if you know the Italians, you know they've got great olive oil too. But if you've ever been to Greece, you buy an olive oil. That's what in Italy, you're probably gonna buy some wine and ship it home. In Greece, you're buying olive oil. Well, that goes back to Solon. Solon was the one who basically for Athens said, we need to get into an economic structure. This is why when you get to the Peloponnesian War and you think of Sparta, they're the warriors. When you think of Athens, they're the economic powerhouse. They're the ones who they don't have capitalism per se, but we would look at them and think their system is much more economically based, like a capitalist system. So if you're comparing it, which is not fair to anybody, we're like Athens and USSR was like Sparta. That's, again, unfair to all four people to say it that way, but you get the picture. Solon's developing a cash crop concept. They're developing Athens as the trading center. You go back to that map, all the city-states are near water. There's no reason for Athens to become the dominant naval power or the dominant trading power. There's nothing special about their location connected to water. But nonetheless, they did because of Solon. He actually separates the judicial decision. So he kind of goes to a three-tiered branch with executive, legislative, and judicial. And judicial was put into the hands of the people, largely. There were judges, of course, but the courts were all run by citizen juries. That was unique pretty much in all the world. And then he went a step further and created a new group called the Ecclesia. Now, if you know your Christian background, your Christian history, you go, wait, that word sounds familiar. Isn't that the word that the writers of the New Testament used to describe the gathered group of Christians? And then that later becomes, in English, the word church. It is. So that's why Paul and the writers of the New Testament used that word, because they knew that the Greek readers would understand an assembled group of people. And that all comes back from Athens. So Solon's government establishes an assembly, much like the Roman assembly. And you note that only the top two social classes are involved. So it's not everybody, but they do vote on all the decisions. And it kind of, so you have this council of the Areopagus. Now you have this Ecclesia, which is basically a larger group. We would see it as somewhat like our Congress in total. So not two separate houses, but just one group. Then, to try to help distinguish who was doing what, he made a smaller group called the Council of the 400, whose job was to prepare the topics of deliberation. Now, so this is a key step on the road to democracy. Let me go ahead and say now, my definition for democracy is all the people vote on all the issues all the time. Now, the reason I say that is because that's what the Athenians do. They're not going to get there yet. You can imagine, though, in a system, just think about Westminster. How many people live there? 5, 6, 7, 800 people live there, right? If you had everybody gathered all the time to make decisions, that part is understandable. We could all vote on things at Westminster. But if you then thought about who's going to decide what we're voting on, well, that can become a little bit of a confusion with people yelling out, I think we should have this, I move we do this, and you'd have all kinds of, who knows if some of the ideas coming from the crowd even have merit, even can be done, right? So Solon's thought was, we need a smaller group. Now, you and I might think 400 is not small, but that kind of hints to how big the Ecclesia was. The Ecclesia is pretty big. So we have a smaller group of 400, and they will decide what the agenda is. Now, that was a power grab that we'll see in a moment gets changed, because it still allowed the kind of upper crust to somewhat control the conversation. So that's Solon, step 2. Now, Solon, not surprisingly, his reforms were not received well by the rich upper crust. It's kind of like the past 20 years, both Republicans and Democrats have talked about we need to tax the richer people more. And you'll hear sometimes the rich people saying, you should tax us more, you should tax us more, until such time as Congress starts talking about taxing more, and then nobody wants to be taxed, right? We all understand this story. Now, I remember when President Bush had first proposed some taxes, and the Democrats under President Bush were really pushing for more taxes. And they had said that the tax would fall on people making $200,000, because that's a rich person. And then when President Obama became the president, and the Democrats controlled the House and the Senate, all of a sudden, they wouldn't go for it. And you heard the Democrats themselves tap dancing back to where they're like, maybe it should be 400, 500,000. That's going to be where a rich person is. If you make $500,000 a year in the United States, you're just middle class. Well, having never made more than, I think my last salary, I don't know what I'm talking about, it's like $80,000. So I'm a long way from 5. I'm a long way from 2. I'll never make $200,000 a year unless something weird happens. You're going to try and tell me $500,000 is middle class. Man, we're on 2 different conversation points, right? So that tells you a lot. The rich people, and if I was rich, I might be the same way. And maybe one of you is rich, and so you definitely feel this way. They want to control their power. They want to protect their wealth. They want to protect their position. I get it. I totally get it, right? So they don't like Solon's reforms because he's opening the door from government to more people. So there's tensions and there's political wranglings and things that kind of work in the process. And this leads us to our third step. And this is Piezostratus. Now, again, usually Draco and Piezostratus, so 1 and 3, they're usually held up as the bad guys. And if you Google Piezostratus, you'll usually see the word tyrant or tyranny. Now, when you and I hear the word tyrant or tyranny, we immediately put the little equal sign and then the word dictator to the side, because we think of Stalin, we think of Hitler, we think of Ho Chi Minh, we think of Castro, and then we think of all the negatives of those people. And in the Greek and largely ancient world, it wasn't a positive to be a tyrant, but it wasn't evil. The tyrant was really just a person who took power and was not there by blood or not there by the choice of the people. See, sometimes these power pyramids, it was not a vote, but everybody knows Paul's going to be the leader because he's the smartest, and we're all cool with that. So he's chosen to be the leader. Or we know that Bob's going to be the leader because he's the strongest. He's killed the most people in all of our battles with the enemy tribes around us. So Bob's the leader. And we're all good with that. So we kind of accept it. We choose Bob to be the leader because we know he's the strongest. He can defend us all, right? But sometimes in antiquity, power is seized, just like it is in modern times. And that's considered a tyrant. But to be a tyrant was not a bad thing. And Piezostratus is perhaps the best example of this. Basically, Piezostratus rules Athens along Solon's plan. He doesn't really reform Solon's plans. He doesn't change Solon's plans. The one thing he does is there's no election for Archon. It's going to be him. So that's a change. And he does basically structure it under intimidation and a little bit of political maneuvering that it is going to pass from him to his son, Hippias, who we'll meet. So that, again, but in broad terms, in essence, you could say is Piezostratus does what Octavian will do 500 years later. Octavian will go to his death claiming to still have protected and preserved the Republic. Contemporary historians know that the empire starts with Octavian. And so to this day, everybody knows the empire, you can point some things at Julius Caesar, but in general terms, the empire starts with Octavian. He's the one who is the leader who kills the Republic in Rome. And I think Piezostratus is kind of in that same direction. You see it a lot. They both do the same sort of thing. Piezostratus had no problem killing people, neither did Octavian, but he also spent a lot of money doing public works, fixing up Athens, building new temples, building new roads, making sure things were better for the economy. He actually made sure to really embrace the rural citizens, the people on the furthest reaches of the city, and making sure that they were taxed less, created a new system of traveling judges who could bring more equity to the justice system for the rural poor. He built the temple to Zeus. And when you look at, with Octavian, it's very famously talked about how he used bread and circuses. And my students get all confused because, one, they don't think bread's that cool, and aren't circuses evil because they have animals. I'm like, no. Think of it this way. Modern time for my students, I'm like, it's like the person asking you to vote for them is promising you a new gaming system every year, and there'll be at least one paid vacation every month. We're going to ask the NFL to play a Super Bowl game every month. So there's going to be a Super Bowl Monday holiday every month. And I'm also going to make sure that I give you a $500 food voucher at Publix every month. So the bread is food, the circuses is games, entertainment. And the critics and I think scholars who look at it realize what's going on is kind of a smoke and mirrors type of thing that, again, you see many times in history, and maybe effectively to kind of keep the people somewhat satisfied, but not willing to get mad about their loss of voting, their loss of control. So while Piezostratus is in charge, there's not really any problems. When he dies, his sons are not as adept as he is, and there's rivalry that is growing amongst the upper class. So between his death in 527 and really 510, so almost 2 decades, tension begins to emerge to where one of his sons, Hipparchus, is assassinated. Hippias becomes a little bit of a tyrant, a little bit more of a harsh, brutal person. And so there's an overthrow, right? So you still made me think, wait, I don't think I'm hearing anything that sounds like democracy. And you're right. Right now with Solon, it's really much more like the Romans did, kind of where it's a government of the people, but there's a lot of distance. But then because of the overthrow, Sparta gets involved, because Sparta is always the foil with Athens. They're kind of 1A and 1B is who's going to be most in charge of what's happening on this peninsula. Not in charge of the Greeks, but in charge of just the area in which they live. And so into the story comes person number 4, Cleisthenes, right? So Cleisthenes is one of the leaders who's there in the aftermath of the 2 sons. His opponent is Isagoras. Isagoras allies with Sparta. Cleisthenes allies with the Athenian people. It's a long story short, there's about a 1.5 year tussle over who's going to be in charge. And ultimately, the Spartans will invade the city with a small group. In that moment, Cleisthenes basically turns to the Athenian people and says, defend yourselves. And they do, en masse. They rise up, and even though the Spartans are great warriors, you can't beat a mob. The mob pushes Isagoras and the Spartan warriors up to the Parthenon, basically isolates them on that hill, and demands and forces them to flee the city. And then the people turn to Cleisthenes and say, all right, you get to be in charge, but we're going to restructure everything. And so they do. And so this is the beginning of the rise of the democracy. So the democracy, if republic comes from the Latin words I showed you, the democracy comes from these Greek words. The word demos for the people, kratos for rule. So the people rule. And Cleisthenes was very well aware that he was only going to have any authority based on the people allowing him to have it. So they immediately structure a whole new reform. They go so far as to basically restructure your identity. Remember I told you there was the 3 ancient tribes? Now we're several hundred years later. So that'd be like us saying one of us was of the tribe of John Adams and one of us was the tribe of Thomas Jefferson and one of us was of the tribe of some of these other great, even further back, right? So John Winthrop, right? Or John Smith from Jamestown. And, that what would that even mean? I mean, it's 400 years later from Jamestown. None of us can even really identify with that directly. So Cleisthenes in the reform group restructures the city into 10 regions that were in essence around, we would call it like a village, but a section of the city that they identified as what they call the deme. And so the location of where you lived became your voting group. And that broke down tribal, you no longer saw yourself as one of those 3 ancient tribes, although I'm sure that maintained to some degree, but your identity was here. Citizenship was given to everybody in the city, but then from a sense of participation, it was the males, that's normal. I know for us who have daughters and for women and for us who we think we're all progressive, we go, yeah, that's not good enough. But in their minds, that was normal. Only the men participated everywhere. The deme would elect officials for local leadership, and then those officials would then be voted into the new council, Solon's council 400 became the council of 500. Now they didn't really need 500 people. Again, you can imagine that's probably a mess, but that allowed him to have a very easy math of 50 leaders from every deme got to come to the council where they would debate and discuss what issues were going to go to the Ecclesia. But then in the big move, the Ecclesia was open to every citizen. So everybody could attend, and they met weekly or nearly weekly, and they voted on things. So all the citizens voted on all the issues all the time. If you didn't vote, it was only because you didn't go, which of course was your right. But there was no decisions made without the vote of the people. There's a very famous moment when Pericles is in charge after the Battle of Marathon. The Greeks realize the Persians are probably going to come back, and they have to get ready. And in that same time period, there is a massive find of silver. And it's several millions of dollars of modern money, and it belonged to the people of Athens. Now, a typical leader would have just taken the money and the silver and the wealth and used it for whatever he thought was best for national defense. Pericles knew he couldn't do that. So using all his political skill and savvy, he goes to the Ecclesia to say, we need to spend this money on defense, and particularly building a navy to try to fight off the Persians. Will you, in essence, give up your money? It'd be as if we decided as a nation to give up all the equity that we had in our stocks and bonds and our mortgages. And we're all going to just put it in a huge pot for the government to spend on some national issue, right? Well, that's going to be one thing if Congress dictates that down to us. It'd be a very different thing if all the people of the United States voted on the issue themselves, right? So this was a very big move, and this is that moment where Cleisthenes is, I think, accurately noted as the first or the leader who brings in the democracy. Again, I like to argue Solon deserves more credit than he gets. But basically, once you get to here, you now have the democracy. That's a structure. Now, let's compare these two. In Rome, both are governments of the people. This is why I think, and we'll talk about this more next week, why I think moderns like to blend these two words and sort of come up with, yes, they must be synonyms. I still would argue that there's no room for them to be synonyms. In Rome, the people had a voice through representatives of a type. They could attend the assembly, but it was only to watch. They could run for office, in essence, and they could rise up, even to the point of rising into being one of the tribunes, one of the consuls. It'd be tougher for a poor person to ever become a consul, but there were some moments when you saw this kind of a thing happen, non-wealthy, non-senatorial families. In Athens, after Cleisthenes, the people have direct control. Every issue is voted on by all the citizens. Now, again, for moderns, they will criticize one or both places because they'll say, well, not everybody who was born there got to participate, in particular, the women, ergo, it's not really a democracy. Now, that's an unfair attack because the better way to look at it is everybody who could be a citizen, which in the minds, and quite honestly, as we heard from Professor Bryson, even into the 1800s, in the minds of most people, that would only be males. You and I don't have to like that. As a father of daughters and married to a brilliant woman, I don't like that. But that doesn't make them, that doesn't mean that they were bad or somehow incorrect previously. It's just the way they understood the world. And I'm glad I don't live in that world in that way, but I get it that that's what they did. They allowed everybody who was a citizen to participate. It's sort of like what the French tried, the French Revolution, one of their many, remember we talked about the French Revolution and they have all these iterations of their governments. And in one of their iterations, they established the idea that you could be a passive citizen or an active citizen. And the bottom line, there were issues about property and some different things for the French, but the bottom line was basically, we would say, who gets to vote? Who gets to run for office? And to some degree, it's what the Athenians and the Romans were doing. But in the Roman world, only some people got to actively be in government. Like right now, you guys know I ran for office in Little Winter Park, little local. I lost. So I'm not in government. I don't get to vote on anything. I lost that election. If we were a democracy in Winter Park, I could vote every time there was a vote to be taken if I went to the meeting. But we're not a democracy, right? So that's their idea. It's also important, I think, to note when we compare these two that both took decades, really centuries of development. For Rome, we kind of look at that 509 moment, 509 BC, through the 250s, with maybe the critical moment being when the assembly tribune gained veto power. The assembly had existed before that, the veto power was not gained to the 280s. In Athens, it's again about 200 years. Rome's about 250. In Athens, about 200 years, 650 to 450, with probably the critical moment being, around Cleisthenes. That moment where he versus Isagoras, the coming of the Spartans, the rising of the people, and then the people not giving up their opportunity, right? They didn't just win the battle against Isagoras and then say, hey, Cleisthenes, do what you want to do. They took over. And there was a reform movement that worked alongside Cleisthenes. And so he was not able to structure anything like before. The Athenians make a clear break with everything and every other people around them. Now, there were some other Greek city-states who tried this stuff, but none of them really did anything as thorough as the Athenians. Athens and Rome create these unique moments, but they were very hard to maintain. I probably should put on the slide, the number one reason is what I already said to you guys, something in us as a species, even though we like to claim that we want to be government of the people, we see in our own day, right? We're not a democracy, but we don't have 100% voting of those who can vote, right? And there's reasons we could ask ourselves why, and we could say different things, but maybe the short answer is people who didn't vote don't want to vote. They don't want to be bothered for a variety of reasons. And so then I think that's telling about us. They're very hard to maintain. Part of the challenge is there's always the allure to power of the upper crust, as we've already said more than once. That issue of citizenship was very challenging. For the Romans, it becomes more challenging because they expanded. The Athenians never expand. They never try to conquer the rest of the peninsula. The Romans conquer the totality of the Italian peninsula. Then they conquer part of the Iberian Peninsula, mostly you can just think of the full Western Mediterranean. Rome conquers. So now you've got a structure by which you're supposed to have some voting or representatives, but you can't, if you're 20 miles away, you're not walking to Rome. And if you're 100 miles away or 500 miles away, you're not taking a boat from Carthage over to Rome across the Mediterranean to try and vote on some daily issue. So the citizen issue really becomes problematic for the Romans as they kind of works their way through their decades. Athens' problem is more external because literally, we're 508, right? We said 508, 507. So 17 years later is the Battle of Marathon. So you've got the Persians coming for about a 30-year window, and then they never really go away. Then you have the blow up between Sparta and Athens, which probably had been brewing for a century, that explodes into the Peloponnesian War, which probably was caused mostly through the hubris of the Athenians. So, in one sense, you could say Athens only was able to really maintain the democracy for roughly a century, which is telling, again, I think. The Athenian democracy dies when they basically lose the Peloponnesian War. And then 80 years, 70 years after that, power on the peninsula shifts north. First to Thebes, then ultimately to Macedon. And then, of course, that's going to be the coming of Alexander and eventually Alexander the Great and the Macedonians, who the Athenians and everybody lower on the peninsula thought were barbarians. So once that happens, there's really no more democracy. in Athens. It's totally put to bed by the Romans when they conquer the Eastern Med around 150 to 100 BC. For Rome, it's obviously later in the story. When the Punic Wars end with Carthage in 146, as I just said, they had expanded so much. Their government needed massive reform. But when reform came, it was opposed. And not opposed like we saw in Greece, where there was some people who didn't like what Solon did. This came in the form of assassination. So there were 2 or 3 leaders in the decades immediately after the Punic Wars who try to suggest reform, and they're assassinated. They're not just voted out of office, they're just killed. And this really kicks off what will be a century of chaos in Rome, to the point that ultimately you'll have like 4 civil wars. And then, as I said at the beginning, you come back to, to this guy, right? To Octavian. And the light's weird, there you go. And Octavian's coming after Caesar is assassinated. You end up in these civil wars, and a society just falls apart. And as people were eager for the wars to end, Octavian came along and said, I can do that. And he did. He ended the war. He ended chaos. He structured a whole bunch of really positive sounding things. It's just that the Republic had to die along with it. So you lose the crisis. So we'll stop there, having laid out the Romans and their version of government of the people, and the Athenians and their different version of government of the people. And again, I wish we were in person so I could answer questions. Again, I urge you, if you have questions, to don't hesitate to get those to Becca, or email me. I think all of you on here have got my personal email at the college, and I will happily give that to you, or my personal email here at my office, either one, so you can have that. But I wish we had time to have that conversation. Next week, our 3rd week before we end for the year, like I said, we will be focusing on, well, what happens, particularly what happens when you get to the 1800s. So that the 2 words, well, I think the better way of saying it is that the one word, democracy, becomes elevated, and the other word, republic, becomes diminished. And why did that happen? Not just here in the United States, but sort of throughout the world. Why did thinkers and political scientists and theorists see democracy as some kind of holy and pure and just thing, and yet never actually structuring a real democracy? What we end up being structured is something else. Well, it's usually a republic, but that's a whole different conversation. All right, everybody. Thank you so much. I love you guys. I hope you have a wonderful weekend, and I will see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carl.
Okay, it was a good lecture.